I think the industry is driven by the performance. The security and the privacy will only be secondary considerations, but our researchers feel that's very, very important. So that's why we're working on this field.
Welcome to another episode of the AI Purity Podcast, the show where we explore the complex intersection of artificial intelligence, ethics, and its societal impact. Today's guest is an esteemed researcher and educator whose expertise spans the intricate domains of hardware security, cybersecurity, and trusted AI. As an associate professor at Tufts University and a recipient of prestigious accolades, including the NSF CAREER Award, our guest's groundbreaking research has illuminated the critical intersection of AI technologies and cybersecurity, unraveling the complexities of safeguarding AI systems in an era rife with emerging threats. Join us as we discuss the challenges of ensuring trustworthy AI and the evolving landscape of cybersecurity in the age of artificial intelligence. Welcome to the show, Dr. Yingjie Lao.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and I'm happy to chat about hardware security, trust AI in general.
Thank you so much for being here. Well, please tell us what initially sparked your interest in computer science and engineering.
Just like when I grew up, all those technology keep evolving, but not. I mean, it's more right now because of the AI, but at the time, still, thinking about like 20 years back, like a lot changed because of the technology. So then I just feel like I'm very interested and I feel like the technology to be like a very fascinating to me. So then I decided to pursue a career in the computer science engineering.
And was there a pivotal moment or experience that solidified your decision to pursue a career in academia and research?
Background for me is when I just about to graduate from my PhD study, so I applied for both the industrial jobs and the academic jobs. But then I ended up going to Broadcom to work for like a little bit over a year, and then I decided to come back to academia. So and a bit history is at that time. Broadcom was acquired by Avago. So, so there were a lot of like concerns, worries in the industry. But for me, that's also play a part. But on the other hand, then I get an idea about what the industry is doing, and obviously during my PhD, I kind of know the type of research or the type of work in the academia setting. So then I figure I probably like the academia setting more. So I decided to come back to academia and then just like working on those different type of research.
And what was it that inspired your focus on hardware security and cybersecurity within the realm of computer science?
Yeah, so my PhD actually is more about hardware security because I do have a background of like integrated circuit design, like those hardware architecture and the VLSI stuff. But then I interested in security because at the time I was just trying to explore different areas, different research topics. But for the security, it's really like you have the attack and the defense. You need to be in the adversarial setting. So always like you need to keep the other party or the other counterpart in mind when you develop, for example, when you develop some defense mechanisms, you need to be aware of the existing or the most advanced attacks. So then try to come up with a countermeasure against those attacks. So then not only just that, it's also like you can always keep going. You have an attack, you have a defense, you can just keep going. So then I just find that's like very interesting to me. Then and also at the time, like the hardware security is pretty new, like a very emerging field of research of study. So a lot of rooms for improvement. So that's why like I got very interesting and decided to pursue my PhD in that direction. But now I'm actually expanding my research to a lot of different domains, but mostly it centers around the security and the privacy. Not only hardware security, as you mentioned, the cybersecurity and the trusted AI. So trusted AI also security privacy of AI systems. Now, and as a lot of other colleagues or researchers do. So I'm actually focusing on the large language models. So so we're working on like the security and the privacy issues of large language models. Those might not be like directly relevant to the hardware, but all about security.
I would love to talk about that later on as well, how we can, secure LLMs. But I wanted to ask you, how do you think researchers and developers approach the balance for the need for security and privacy in AI systems with the desire for innovation and performance?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important question. I'm not sure like how to address that. My opinion is there clearly there's a need, but when you look at the industry, so not only just for the hardware security, but I think also for the overall like cybersecurity or large language model security privacy. So the same thing is like industry most of the time it's driven by performance. But when we want to add some security and the privacy mechanisms, so there always going to be a trade-off. So it will either be the performance or the efficiency or like some other like performance relevant metrics. I think from like what I've heard so far, so industry always like kind of reluctant to deploy those security or privacy mechanisms unless they have to. Because there's a trade-off. And also for the hardware, for example, for the hardware security, when we add something, there always gonna be some overhead. It could be like area consumption, speed, power, energy consumption. So even if it's as small as like 1 or 2 or 3%, I think the company typically will think that to be too much. And also those may not necessarily help them to attract more customers. From the profit perspective, it may not help actually. So then I just find it might be very difficult to convince the industrial companies to deploy those hardware security countermeasures. But I think that's the same for the trusted AI. So now just the model, I think you're aware there are like subfield of so-called interpretable and explainable AI. So those model in order to try to explain what's going on. So the master can only work with relatively smaller models, and we can understand like what's going on, why this model arrives this decision. Like we can come up with some explanation for that particular decision. But now it comes to those state-of-the-art models, very deep neural networks, or even now the large language models. So there's like not such tools can help us to understand why the model behave like this, why the model like output something or like their works try to understand that, but still like we all consider nowadays those large models they are like black box instead of white box. So then I think there's clearly a need to understand that, but I think the industry is driven by like the performance, not I would say security and the privacy will only be like some secondary considerations, but our researchers like we all feel that's very, very important. And for both the hardware security and cybersecurity or even like trusted AI. So that's why like we're working on this field. So along with the industrial development, we hope we can come up with some protective mechanisms. We can come up with some mechanisms that can help enhance the security and the privacy of those different systems, different applications, so that there will not be very severe, bad consequence later on.
Yeah, and could you share some insights of the strategies that researchers and developers employ to stay ahead of these emerging threats in the field of hardware security and AI, just as because it's as important, like you said, with performance?
Yeah. So, and actually, that's always the question we get when we try to publish a paper or write a grant proposal for emerging like attack those vulnerability threats. So reviewers, I mean, other people always tended to say, so this never happened. So that's not maybe not will not be an issue later on. But I think that's like really the nature of the research. So we always try to stay ahead of what's happening right now. So we want to be proactive instead of waiting for something to happen. Then we try to find a countermeasure at that time. So we always try to think ahead of the time and try to think about what's going to happen. And then if that happens, what kind of countermeasure we can come up with. So that's so-called like a threat model. So we always try to think about threat model that may not actually gonna happen like today or this year. Maybe something can happen like in 2 years, in 5 years down the road. So that's why that's when we try to publish a paper or come up with the research, like say, focus on the attacking side of the security, right? And then once we have like an emerging attack, and we think that's possible, that could be a realistic threat later on, and then we can start to develop those defensive solutions, countermeasures, try to detect those possible attacks, and then try to mitigate those threats. But I think it's very important. It need the whole community to just think ahead. So we don't really want those attacks to happen actually in real world. So we want to address them before they can happen.
And talking about like the community looking ahead and kind of like preparing for these like threats and attacks, how do you see the role of interdisciplinary collaborations between developers, researchers, even social scientists and computer scientists in advancing efforts in hardware security and AI?
That's actually also very important. I've been involved in many like those interdisciplinary projects. So we look at the different security or privacy issues, but probably not so much for the hardware security. Hardware security, like we definitely need input from the industry in terms of because in the academia setting, I mean the kind of product we target is relatively small in scale. Um, but if like those methods we develop can scale up to those commercial industrial products, so that's a question we have to study. So then we needed to work with our industrial partners, developers to understand like what are the potential issues when we scale our method from the academic setting to the industrial setting. But I think it's more important for the collaboration with like social science and other areas of researchers on the trusted AI. So there's big discussion nowadays, so-called those power-seeking AI or the AI with subject experience. So there's huge debate like do we need to make sure the AI can have some sentiment or self-awareness before like the AI can be power seeking. So a lot of those questions are not only engineering or technology questions. So they are also very relevant to those social science, even like neuroscience, and the medical field, like researchers who study the brain, like how human behavior, human actions that are relevant to the environment. So all those I think are pretty essential to address the big question about the AI, like how the AI can actually go. What will be our goal to actually to develop AI to mimic human, or we wanted to develop AI just stay as AI, but not really as intelligent as human. So, I mean, for me, I cannot answer those questions for sure. So that certainly need interdisciplinary efforts.
And as an educator, how do you integrate your research findings into your teaching curriculum to prepare students for the evolving landscape of this technology?
We always do. We always try to integrate the latest findings in the research to the course. So this semester actually, I mean, just the past semester, just to wrap up the semester of course. So I was teaching like a course called AI security and privacy. Then students they are all very interested in like those very recent threats, like most of them center around the large language model, like ChatGPT, those type of security vulnerabilities. So then obviously we will need to integrate those newest findings from the research community or from the developers into the curriculum. But I would say it will be easier for special topic courses. What I was teaching, just like where we focus on one like kind of research topic, but it will be slightly challenging to integrate newest findings into like more regular courses, like required courses in the undergraduate level. So for the graduate level, we always try to come up with course projects to ask a student to work on some emerging directions and the area like they're mostly interested in. And as for those projects or research I mean the course topics, most of the time, so they are like very novel. I mean very new. So then we have to integrate the research into those courses. And I think that's beneficial, like to have the students like to be informed of the state of the art and the newest development in this research topic.
Absolutely agree. And earlier you were talking about large language models. I wanted to get your thoughts on generative AI tools and large language models like ChatGPT and its widespread use for both as a tool and being used for bad in educational settings, because obviously you are an educator as well.
I think that actually help a lot, but not so much on the education setting, but like I mean research-wise. That's my own experience. So I work with like a group of graduate students. So now like I think definitely they are very good at using ChatGPT. So the paper like they can write a much better paper than say like 2 or 3 years ago. Then the time like there were no ChatGPT or other large language models. So I think that's definitely a very good, a very powerful tools, but just we cannot completely rely on the ChatGPT. So my suggestion for my own students are like you can only if you want to use ChatGPT to help you to write some paragraphs, you'd better not to copy the entire paragraph because it's still like very clear not only for the those research papers, even for the emails. Like when I receive an email from students, like you can clearly tell this email is from like ChatGPT or like another email is like human like handwritten, manually like written. So there's clear difference. But when we submit a research paper, you don't want others to know like the paper writing is done by ChatGPT. So and we do have concern about those misinformation as well, because sometimes ChatGPT might or other large language models might output something like just doesn't make sense. So we have to do those quality control. But overall, I think by using the ChatGPT, my work and the students' work well is like much easier than before. We're still thinking about how we can integrate those large language model into the education setting. So I'm not working on it right now, but I know a few colleagues. So they are working on. So one example is like a group of colleagues of mine, not at Tufts. So in our community of hardware community, so they are trying to develop a tool that can use it to help students to debug hardware like those coding so-called like hardware description language. So because the current commercial large language models, they are not that like focus on those HDL. So they are very good at Python or other programming code, but not so much on the like hardware related codes. So then just like a group of researchers, they're trying to develop a large language model tool that can that is dedicated for the hardware development. So they're working on those, and I think those could be like very valuable and useful for students like in those like areas of hardware design, hardware development, and testing.
Well, on the other hand, I wanted to get your thoughts on AI-generated content detection platforms or AI text detectors, for example. Are you for the use of these? Because I've talked to educators who are, open to the idea. Some of them are not because it might impinge on, obviously, the essays are the intellectual property of the students and, professors or the educational institutions may not have the right to input their essays or their data into these platforms. So, and I think that would impede on their, data privacy and security. So I wanted to get your thoughts on AI content detectors.
Right. So actually, one of my current project is large language model watermarking. Just try to give the generate output a watermark, and then later on, there's a mechanism that can use it to detect if this, I mean, the generated content is from like a particular large language model. I mean, the watermarked large language model. So in general, I think that's a very important like question, a very important challenge to address. But there are several concerns about it, like how to do it. So first, like I want to mention about why it's important because I think now still like the best strategy, as I mentioned earlier, for the students, like they should not completely use like whatever generated from the large language model. So they still need to spend a good amount of effort to like edit the generated text before they can actually use it. So that's a starting point. But I think later on, like maybe people or maybe there are already someone like they feel very confident with the generated text from the large language models, then they directly use that for certain tasks. So that may be dangerous, like because some of those information may not be true, right? So that could potentially cause some harms. And also, I think the main issue later on will be, so we're in the era of big data. So a lot of data, they're generated by sensors, like different type of sensors, cameras, or there are like a social network. A lot of those contents are created every day, every minute. So those are big data. So we can use those big data to train some models to perform like a variety of tasks. But I think the issue later on will be we're now using large language model to generate the data. And then I don't know, like maybe 10 years from now. So the world, I mean, the data in the entire world, maybe like half of them they're real data, then half of them they're generated data, and then those generated data may be dominant later on. Then like what we are going to deal with, just like all those generated data. So if everything is going well, then maybe it's fine. I don't know. Um, Even if assuming like everything's going well, it still may not be fine because you're kind of feeding those generated data back to large language model. Maybe later on we call it something else, may not be just some kind of model at that time. But those data are not real data, right? So they are generated data. So then something may happen. So I don't know. So I have concern about that, but it will be more concerning if those generate data like they have some bias, they have some specific distribution that is different from the real data. So then like all of those data like I mean will kind of shift from what we are right now. I'm not sure if that will be a good thing or it will be a bad thing, but certainly that will be something to be like concerned of. And then in terms of detecting the AI generated content, so in my own opinion, I feel it will become more and more difficult. So on one hand, I know like OpenAI, they try to develop some tools to detect the generated content. And they are OpenAI, right? They know what they're doing. So they know like how they develop the ChatGPT. But I didn't know what's the current status, but last time I checked, they stopped their development for the AI detector in July last year. So the issue is just like the accuracy of the detection seemed to be very low. Then in order to use those AI detector, I think those detectors have to have a very high confidence and a very high accuracy. Then you can actually reliably use that to say something. So just for example, if we have a paragraph that's detected by like some detector, say it's 80% of the chance that's generated by AI, but 80% doesn't really mean anything. So you cannot use 80% to do anything. So there was the news, I think it was last year, like one faculty member in one of the university like failed the entire class because they put like the class um, their like a project report or essay into some kind of detector. They even asked the ChatGPT. So just got the response like all of those are generated by AI. So then they think that's the AI so-called not instead of plagiarism, it's AI plagiarism. Then they're gonna fail the entire class. But I think just like in order to do something like that, you have to have like a detector. It's proving to be very reliable, very accurate, with very high confidence. 80% is it's not good enough. So that's a challenge, in my opinion. But on the other hand, I think the another challenge will be, I'm not sure what those companies like large language model developers what they're thinking, but if they try to really mimic the generated text as like a human written language, so try to close the gap between the large language model and the human. Then the gap will become smaller and smaller. So now you probably can still see a good difference between like the emails from ChatGPT or human written. But as the technology involvement, I mean, maybe some companies want to close the gap. And then later on, when ChatGPT writes an email, maybe I cannot tell the difference. So at that time, then obviously it will be extremely difficult to detect whether like a text or email is generated by large language model by AI or not. But I think that's a trend. So the gap is gonna be smaller and smaller. Then how we can detect that, I think it will be like more and more challenging. But on the other hand, I think it might be a solution, just like instead of relying on the original large language model, we can add some watermark, right? We can add something into the generated text. So on purpose. And then later on, we might be able to use that to detect if the content is generated by AI or not.
Oh, and could you talk about that research part that you were talking about watermarking? So basically, if ever you use an LLM and it generates something, your tool would then put a watermark, so then it would be known that this was an AI generated content, basically.
Right. Right, something like that, but just the watermark has to be like stealthy enough, like invisible enough. So we don't want it to affect the performance. So there are like a good amount of research papers already. So try to watermark the large language model, but so it's just like the generated text will be different from those original model. So but there are several considerations. One is just like it has to maintain the original performance. You don't want to embed a watermark, then the performance become like very low. But on the other hand, you kind of don't want others know. So the text is being watermarked. So it's similar to like maybe like deep fake to create a video. You wanted to have the video like people can, I mean, from the deep fake perspective, you want the video to look like as original as true as possible. But on the other hand, so you also want like there's a method and there's a mark hidden somewhere later can be used to detect if this video is is real or it's generated by some kind of AI or deepfake.
Well, that's really fascinating. And I think that would be a really innovative technology. And I think that also helps with transparency because I feel like, the use of generative AI tools and using LLMs, not just in educational settings, is going to be more and more adopted. I don't think there's, like you said, there's no sure way right now to detect AI generated content. So the least we can do is be transparent about what is AI generated and what is human written. And earlier you talked about deepfakes. I wanted to get your opinion on that as well and your insight because there are other types of generative AI tools that are available right now where it's so easy to create a deepfake. It's so easy for you to upload a photo of yourself and have it be uploaded on another person's body or, create an entirely new image. What do you think are the security threats that this could pose to users? Because what do you think that these applications take the data of its users? Is it being used to train that model? What would you have to say about these other generative AI tools?
Yeah. So for all of this, that's actually another like project I'm currently working on, like for the AI, like those privacy. But that's the current practice. So in order to use a certain AI tool, whatever it is, it could be like large language model or those like video generation or those just 3D reconstruction tools. Um, so you have to, so there's a like policy agreement, and you have to click yes or agree to use that. So if you click agree or yes, then basically you agree like you're giving away like all of your data. So we actually did those compliance training. So the basic assumption is whatever data you put to ChatGPT or any large language model, you need to we need to assume it is the same as like we upload those data onto public, right, on the internet. So that's the same thing. So then whatever data we send to the ChatGPT, they are going to log them. That's assumption. I don't know, like those companies, if they actually use the data, so how they use the data, but we just needed to assume that. Then obviously, like all those data later on could be used for training or could it be leaked to somewhere, and we don't have control of that. So I know there are like some efforts and the startup companies, they're trying to develop some kind of firewall just to detect if a particular inputs, a particular query is contain sensitive information or not. If not, then just there gonna be an interface between the local the company data and the ChatGPT. So before all those data leaving the company's local like a network, so there's a firewall to check. So if the firewall thinks the particular input contains something sensitive or private, it just will block those or will try to rephrase those before sending to the ChatGPT. So there are like efforts of doing that, but I think it's just very hard to address that issue. So from technology wise, so there are different ways of protect the privacy. So there are like differential privacy, and there's another area I'm working on, which is a fully homomorphic encryption. So where like all the computation will be performed in the so-called ciphertext, which is like an encrypted message instead of the plain text. So but at this moment it's still like too slow. And obviously you need to work with the those companies because all the computation needed to be in the encrypted form as well. So instead of the large language model, then now the OpenAI needed to host the so-called encrypted ChatGPT. So then they needed to be willing to do that. Um, but I think still it will be very, very difficult because there are huge incentives for those companies to log all the data. So I don't know if they are going to use that, but they can use that for a different purpose. And also I think another very important aspect will be like AI regulation, legislation. So in the Europe, they have those GDPR policy, um, which is a privacy policy. So a lot of companies actually receive huge fines for violating those policies in Europe. But I know the US is also in the process of working on like those AI regulation and legislation. So that might help to improve the user privacy. But in general, I think that's definitely a concern. And but how to use that how to use those tools without compromising the user data privacy. So that's a big challenge. So one way, just as I mentioned, you can use differential privacy, or you can use something, try to use those tools without giving up your personal information. But just sometimes you cannot get the answer you want, right? If you ask something else as opposed to like the direct input where it contains those private information, so you can reverse it. But then you can also get some kind of response, but it will not be the direct response to the original question. So then how to balance those? And there are also like a variety of so-called privacy preserving computing technologies, but how to use that, which one to use, and how to improve those performance. These are all very important research questions.
For those who might not be familiar, could you explain what trusted AI means and why it's significant in today's digital landscape?
Yeah, I think trust AI or responsible AI, or some people use trustworthy AI. I think it's really a broader term. That means we need to be able to trust the AI's decision, the behavior. So we should not worry about there might be some bad or negative impact that can be generated by AI. So now I think in terms of the research or technology perspective, so it encompasses like a variety of research topics, such as like AI security, privacy, explainability, interpretability, fairness, and also like privacy. So there could be more of those, but these are different considerations of the AI. So we hope AI to have those characteristics, so it can be fair and it can be trusted, it can be reliable. But in general, I think the idea is just like we want to make sure the AI will not lead to some negative impact on the overall like human daily life. But that's a huge concern, and there are like a good debate if we needed to continue develop AI to do more tasks, or if we really needed to regulate AI first. And then when we talk about AI, I think I mentioned earlier, so do we really want to close the gap between the AI and the human? And all we wanted to develop AI as just like something we know it's very powerful, but which is distinctively different from human. So we can tell it's AI, it's not human. Yeah, I think I don't know. So to me, I'm not sure. So I'm looking into different topics, different aspects of those. But definitely, in my opinion, these are like very important questions and are also very interesting and exciting research areas. But in my opinion, trust AI is very important. So we all want to uh, trust the AI. So then we can comfortably like use that. Otherwise, to me, like still I don't really trust the generated text of large language model as of now. But on the other hand, so I think there's also like a dilemma. Like now we don't really trust the AI, at least for me. So I will take some extra caution um, to look at those content generated by AI. But if later on, like we all feel very confident with AI, then we take any action, any suggestion by the AI, like then put them into tasks, put them into actions. Then even there's like point like 0.001% of chance it's wrong, but then it might lead to severe consequence.
Well, could you tell us how exactly to develop AI models that are trustworthy?
Yeah, but I think that's a very tough question to answer. So there are like several different research topics as I mentioned earlier. So we have to assume we have to like take all of those into consideration. But these are really like all different tasks. For the security, so there are like different attacks. So we have to develop those countermeasures to against all of those security and the privacy. There's also a lot of issues, like a lot of technology with, I mean, there are like different possible ways to address that, but which one is the best? So we're still like, I mean, the community is still like investigating that, but I think it's just like at this moment, I think it's important to be aware of those security or privacy threats, to be aware of those concerns. And when we develop those AI models, like we at least need to know like those obvious consequences for a particular attack, and then we try to come up with certain ways to protect to ensure the trustworthiness of AI to a certain degree. But I think there's a long way to go. But the good starting point is just we have to be aware of those issues.
And besides being aware of those issues, what else would you say are the most pressing challenges in ensuring the trustworthiness of AI systems?
I'm not sure like which one is the pressing needs, but now it's just like it's really from the industry, those big companies, because we don't really know. I mean, except for those open source large language models. So there are like a few of some companies they want to they are willing to share their large language models. Then we can do some good study. But also on the like another issue for the academia is we don't really have those computing power like GPU nodes as in the industry. So we cannot really run those very large the newest large language models are here. So for us, when we do the research, we just tend to look at those smaller large language models. They might be several like iterations behind the current state of the art. So that means if the current state of art is like the GPT 4.0 or something like that, which was announced yesterday, um, if it's like a qualitatively different from the open source large language model, then what we are doing may not be able to apply to those newest large language models. So we can do a good amount of research on those smaller models. I mean, the smaller large language models are already very large, right? But if those cannot be applied to those nearest model, and also those companies they are not considering those, considering like what we're doing, the considering those security and the privacy threats. while they're developing, then there might be a concern. But that part, I think, really those big companies needed to take some initiative, try to protect the AI, like security and the privacy, try to ensure the trustworthiness of those AI systems.
And earlier you were talking about this. Could you elaborate on the concept of homomorphic encryption and its relevance to ensuring privacy in AI applications?
So the homomorphic encryption, the idea is currently all the cloud computing, I would say most of the cloud computing without using the homomorphic encryption. So we do encrypt the data during the communication. But once the data arrive at the cloud, if you want to do certain operation, you have to decrypt it. And then, so on the other hand, the cloud will know the cloud has access to all of your original data. So we can think about maybe just like certain cloud, right? We are uploading our pictures. So if someone can attack the cloud server, they will be able to see all of our pictures and in the original form. But for the homomorphic encryption, the concept is that all those data will be encrypted, not only during the communication, but also during the computation on the cloud. But that means even someone can attack the cloud server, they will only be able to see our image in the encrypted form. Then just they basically cannot see anything, right? Those are encrypted, look like some kind of random image. They don't know what's really going on. So there could be all sensitive, private, like images or information, but it will not be leaked to anyone else. So then for the homomorphic encryption, like we can still do computation on the cloud. And once the computation is done, the cloud can send those results to us, but those results will also be encrypted. So then we can only use our personal key, a private key, to decrypt the result to get what we want. So the private key, we don't need to share it with anyone else. So that means like the entire communication and the computation will be 100% private. So that's a very promising technology. But the issue is now it's just like still like in the early development stage. It's slow, so it cannot scale to very large neural network or the large language model as of now. But as the computing power evolves and also the algorithm development, so yeah, I think that could be a solution to completely address that, because there will not be any privacy leakage, because all the data will be in the encrypted form.
And now I wanted to talk about the cybersecurity threats in the age of AI. With the increasing integration of AI technologies into various sectors, what would you say are the primary cybersecurity threats that organizations should be most vigilant about?
So I'm not like directly working on the cybersecurity, like a different area, so I'm not 100% sure. But I think the issue now is just like it's twofold. One is a lot of the attack nowadays can be used by, I mean, you can use AI to enhance those attacks. So there are like a variety of attacks. So previously, you just collect the data and then use some conventional methods or optimization method to try to figure out, I mean, the keys, the password, or something like that. But now with the help of AI, so all those methods, those attacks can be like way more effective, way more easier than before. So that means the defense mechanism, like the requirement for them for the defense will also be much higher than before. So that's one concern. And another concern to me will be like we all know AI is powerful, and a lot of those detection or defense solutions, there are now actually a lot of startup companies or there are a lot of works efforts there by using AI to defend against those threats. But it's also very important to be aware of that, like when you have AI in your system. So also the AI can do a very good job to detect those cybersecurity threats, but it's also possible that AI could be the weakest link um, in the entire system. So that means the adversary, the attacker can target the AI model itself instead of target like the original cybersecurity problem application, right? Because we have the AI and they can attack the AI to bypass the entire defensive solution, defensive system. So that's also another concern. I'm not quite sure like what's the current state of art in that area, but I think just like when we use AI, we have to make sure those AIs they're reliable. But at this moment, there's still like a lot of potential issues of using AI.
And are there any strategies that you can share for organizations to employ to detect and respond to AI-generated threats effectively?
I think that would just require so first it has to be like too broad. It still will be very hard. I think nowadays there's no like universal solution can be applied to say different attacks or different vulnerabilities. Could be like fairness, bias, privacy, security. So there's no such universal solution. So what we can do, I think, is just like try to be aware of those issues and then try to think about what's really going to happen. So then we needed to narrow down the possible threat, and then we can try to address that. But if it's too broad, I think it will be very hard. So at this point, we can only do something, come up with some mechanism or defensive solutions against a particular threat. So we have to just understand, as you mentioned earlier, we needed to think ahead of the time, and then just try to be aware of what's going on right now in the world. So try to stay informed. And also, when we develop those different products, we need to be aware of those potential issues of AI.
And on a smaller scale, what would you say are some of the things people, users of these AI tools can do to protect themselves from any online threats, especially with more and more people becoming more open to using AI tools?
Yeah, I think just need to be like to have some like critical thinking. Um, just at least I think at this moment, when we use AI, we needed to not like completely trust the generated content. So we needed to think about like if that's like if there's some issues with that. So when we use the AI, so it's very helpful. It's very a good tools, but still I think it will be a better practice that not to completely trust the current tool. So just think about what can go wrong, and and also when we use it, we probably can try to protect our private information. So just to be aware, I think like maybe a lot of users may not aware that um, whatever information you put into ChatGPT actually may leak to public. So just need to all be educated, aware of that. And then when we use those tools, we can try to protect our privacy without giving too much of sensitive information. So that's from the user perspective. And also, as I mentioned, when we get those content, when we get those response, we needed to think about really try to judge if those how to use those like response, how to use those content. And there are also ethical concerns, like we just needed to be educated. So just something you cannot use, just for example, the deep fake. I think a lot of people understand like you cannot use that just to kind of impersonating someone else, but there are still people do. And I also to enforce that, maybe AI regulation could be very useful, but how to take that in place and how to actually enforce those regulation. So that's a question.
And can you highlight any ongoing projects or initiatives that you're particularly excited about in the realm of hardware security and trusted AI?
Yeah, so for the hardware security, I'm currently mainly working on the homomorphic encryption, but we're not really working on the methodology perspective. So because I mentioned earlier, those homomorphic encryption, they tend to be slow. So we're working on the hardware acceleration of those homomorphic encryption. But for the trust AI, so nowadays we're just mostly looking into those large language models. We look at the different type of attacks and privacy issues. And also I mentioned earlier, those large language model watermarking. So another particular area could be interesting is I think there's a huge push nowadays try to deploy large language model onto like mobile device, the cell phones. So that will also open up to like a lot of questions, like how to secure those edge deployment of large language models. On the one hand, so it can help the protect the privacy. Because those data, if you have everything wrong on the edge device, some of the data may not need to leave the mobile phone. But on the other hand, so it also can open up additional like avenues for attacking for vulnerability. But also during the development of those edge computing for the large language model, so it may also, I mean, the model may also behave differently from the cloud counterpart. And then we definitely also need to study those differences and think about if there's any implications on the trusted AI perspective.
And just one last question before I let you go. How do you envision the future evolution of AI in terms of capabilities and security measures?
Yeah, I think this will always be an important question, an important field of study, in my opinion. Just because according to the like the past a few years, the trend or the current development, I mean the AI development is like happens so fast. So a lot of new technology will be popping up later on, and then just those security, privacy mechanisms, those different considerations will, in my opinion, will always kind of lag behind over the development. So it's very hard to catch up with, but it's very important for us to understand those issues. But on the other hand, for those AI regulation, and I think it's also important to address those issues, like we can from the technology perspective and also from the regulation perspective. But I think that's going to happen. Yes, both of those aspects will actually lag behind the development. So then, but there's also like huge needs for these aspects. So we have to study, we have to be aware of it. But I think later on, maybe we can like all work together. Developers, legislators, and the researchers, different industrial sectors can work together to ensure the trustworthiness of AI, to make sure once we have a like much better understanding about the capability of AI or potential threats, risks of AI, then we might be able to come up like a much better practice in developing the next generation AI systems.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lau. And before we go, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience, advice, how to protect themselves online, anything you'd like to say?
No, I think that's pretty much. So thank you for all the insightful questions. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much, and I'm sure our audience is going to learn so much as well from you. Thank you for gracing your podcast, the time and the valuable insights you've shared with us. And of course, thank you to everyone who has joined us on another enlightening episode of the AI Purity Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed uncovering the mysteries of AI generated text and the cutting edge solutions offered by AI Purity. Stay tuned for more in depth discussions and exclusive insights into the world of artificial intelligence, text analysis, and beyond. Don't forget to visit our website, that's www.ai-purity.com, and share this podcast to spread the word about the remarkable possibilities that AI Purity offers. Until next time, keep exploring, keep innovating, and keep unmasking the AI. Goodbye. Thank you so much, Dr. Lau. Have a
Yes,
great
thank
day
you.
ahead. Thank you. Goodbye.